Welcome to the Conversations That Matter podcast. I'm your host, John Harris. Right now, this is a Patreon-only exclusive. I may release it more broadly, but if you are interested in becoming a patron, if at the point you're watching this, it is more public, you can go to patreon.com/worldview conversation, and you can get access to videos like this that are released at least for a period of time just to patrons. And one of the reasons I'm doing this limited release first is because I want to talk through this with my closest supporters who appreciate what I do and want to see it continue. And many of you have asked me to do something like this. And I think it'll be probably the first video in a series of videos that tackle the subject of how Christian apologists respond to charges of support for slavery in the Bible or in Christian societies. And for us, that means in the Old and New Testaments, and also in the American context that I'm thinking from. That's where I've been raised, and that's where I'm sitting right now in the United States. The question is, how come the Bible Belt seems to have, at least in the 19th century, the highest concentrations of plantations and participation in slavery in that sense? Doesn't that seem like a hypocrisy? Maybe Christians are just evil. And so this charge is brought. And I think that Christian apologists have just done a very poor job in the last few decades, which is the time I've been alive watching this. And I've been someone who on college campuses has had to, over the last 15 years, navigate these questions. And so I've obviously looked for materials, especially early on in my college career, that address this. And I've never found really good materials, at least from mainstream Christian apologists, which has forced me to do some of my own study and to think through this on a deeper level, I think. And because I have a bachelor's in history and I have a master's in history, and even when I was in seminary, I studied this issue. It's been somewhat of a fascination. It hasn't been something that I want to talk about a lot for obvious reasons too. In 2024, this is the kind of thing that you have to be very careful with when you. One of the reasons I'm actually releasing it to patrons first, because you want to make sure that you say the right things, and you're not going to satisfy everyone. And of course, you will be, what I'm going to say now will be the reasoning that some people have for wanting to shut me up, to cancel me. And so I want to be very careful, knowing it's a sensitive topic. And so that's part of the background to my motivation for doing this. Obviously, people have asked me, and there's that also. And I've put this off for a few years. I haven't been ever afraid to talk about the topic, especially since 2020 with all the woke stuff. And I've done many episodes where I address slavery, but I want to do a more in-depth dive to really help people, to really give them some substance. So it's not just talking points, although you may end up coming up with some talking points from what I'm giving you, but I want to give you the relevant facts that will help you come to a decision on how to navigate this challenge, especially if you're someone who is in ministry on college campuses. Because let me tell you something, it used to be that you would get a lot of questions about science and evolution and the age of the earth and how could you fit all the animals on Noah's Ark. I remember those times, and those questions still come up. But more often than not, questions about homosexuality, about the Bible's teaching on women, about the Bible's teaching on slavery, social issues, these are the things that come up more often than not now. And Christians are woefully unprepared, unfortunately, for, I think, the challenges that they face. And if you're a shrewd or a just honestly, you don't even have to be that shrewd, just someone who is semi-smart and you do a little bit of research and you want to attack the Bible, you're an atheist, let's say, you can have a field day with Christians who are ignorant or framing this whole question in a less than desirable way. And so I want to help Christians equip themselves, which is really the purpose. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't. In fact, you can challenge me. That's part of the reason that I'm doing this for patrons first. And then if this is publicly released, there will be an opportunity in the comments section to let me know what you think. If you think that I've gotten something wrong, I'm not perfect and I can get things wrong. And so I do rely on the people in my audience. I could study something out, but sometimes you catch things and you help inform me of things. So I'm not expecting everyone to agree with everything that I say in this particular podcast or this series, but I do think that there are a lot of things you haven't heard that I'm going to expose to you that are going to help you think through this better. And so you come up with your own answer to these challenges based on God's word as a Christian, and also the common sense that God's equipped you with. So that's my motive. That's where I'm coming from. And I'm looking forward to getting started with all of you. So I do have some video clips that I want to play for you. But before we get to that, I just want to set up the challenge that I think is so often brought before us in this particular topic. So the important prerequisites are a commitment to intellectual honesty and a commitment to biblical truth. If you don't have those two things, then we can't even approach the challenge. You have to understand the importance of objectively derived ethics, right? We're not looking at ethics that change throughout time. Ethics don't change throughout time. Now, that doesn't mean you have different social mores throughout time. You don't have different conditions in which universal ethics must be applied. You don't, and there's actually, when you're talking about mores, especially meaning the cultural patterns and ways that people interact with each other. There's a lot of subjectivity there, actually. But there's a root behind all of these things that's objective. Behind the way that we treat our neighbor is an understanding that God has a moral law and he wants us to treat our neighbor with a certain amount of respect and care and also justice. And the mechanisms for channeling those things and the way that those things are applied can range from society to society. And that would include labor relationships. But at the end of the day, as Christians, we know that there is a God. He's given us a moral law, and we need to understand that that moral law is objective because God himself does not change. And then, of course, a willingness to consider historical circumstance. That's where maybe a subjective element comes in that I just described before, where you have conditions that in a pre-industrial society are different than they are today. And so you may have certain labor relationships and social arrangements that we would consider, if we implemented them today, to not be good. But back in those times, they served a purpose. And so that's the second thing you need to have. And so if you have presentism in your mind and you want to just charge the past with the crimes of not living up to current egalitarian trends or something, then this video is not for you. Unfortunately, I don't think Christianity is for you either. The third thing is being curious enough to ask controversial questions. So you can't be afraid of this stuff. This stuff is going to come up. This stuff is on the college campuses and beyond. And if you just run away from it, it's eventually going to catch you anyway. You have to just honestly secede from all of society. You'd have to find a bunker somewhere if you don't want to talk about these kinds of things as a Christian. So you got to be ready. So the second thing, other than a commitment to intellectual honesty, is a commitment to biblical truth. You need to apply the grammar and history of the scripture. You have to have a grammatical, historical way of approaching it, a hermeneutic, a method of study that seeks to take the Bible on its own terms, in its own context, understanding the greater and lesser context, and understanding scripture applies to itself and comments on itself, and it forms a cohesive whole. And the authors had an original audience that they were writing to, and they had intentions for that audience, but also beyond that for us as believers today. There are lessons to pull from every page of scripture. Number two, you have to be able to submit to God's standard. If you don't have that, then this isn't really going to make sense to you. If you come at this with your own standard, and you can criticize me all day, right, for saying I don't meet up to your standard. That's not the point. I'm trying to, as best I can, apply God's standard to various situations. And then, of course, number three, you got to seek wisdom in moral evaluation and application. So this comes with prayer. This comes with, I think, a level of humility that you don't know everything. And so you're going to be open to what I'm about to share with you. And you're going to be praying that God gives you wisdom as you evaluate it. So those three things, those six things are important prerequisites. So here's the argument. Here's the argument that we get. Slavery is not morally acceptable. Slavery is not morally acceptable. Okay, premise one. Premise two, the Bible teaches slavery is morally acceptable. And then premise three, or the conclusion, the Bible is not morally acceptable. And that follows, if that's true, right? If slavery is not morally acceptable and the Bible teaches slavery is morally acceptable, then the Bible is not morally acceptable. And you have people like Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists. Of course, the new atheists are not new, they're old. He actually died now more than a few years ago. But he was very influential, him along with people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. And he said the Bible indeed does contain a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price. and for indiscriminate massacre, but we are not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude, uncultured human mammals. So, of course, coming at this from a evolutionary, a Darwinian standpoint, he can say that morality is subjective because it's really just the uh, the thinking from animals who don't have an ability to transcend and bind other mammals with their thinking. It's subjective according to fashion, according to power dynamics, according to history. It changes. And so we don't have to actually listen to it. And of course, you should see that he lists a number of things here. It's not just slavery, right? We could add to this probably things like the divine right of kings or uh, arranged marriages or women not being allowed to vote. There's all kinds of things, education not being accessible to all, that today people would say this is terrible. You don't have unions, you don't have labor protections like you do now with OSHA. All of these things belong to the past. They're archaic. They're the dark ages. We've evolved past that. And the assumption is that there is actually some kind of a moral standard, but it's one that that we are heading towards. We're heading towards a utopia of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, perhaps, and we have cast off the chains of yesteryear and are propelling ourselves and reaching ourselves as we evolve into greater levels of morality. It's an evolutionary, it's a Darwinian kind of take on all of this. I want to play for you the way Christian apologists have dealt with this. This is just a short video, and it shows you how Christians who are prominent, these are Christians with big platforms. These are the people your college students are listening to if they're Christians trying to engage these issues. And I want you to hear how woefully unprepared they are. Now, you may not think they're unprepared at this point. By the end of this presentation, I can almost assure you, you will think that. And one of the reasons that even in this clip, I include at the end an atheist talk show with a guy named, I can't remember his name, Matt Dillahunty, I think, in Texas. Now, he has a caller who's a Christian call into his show and try to give some of the defenses of Christianity and some of the arguments to distance Christianity from slavery that you're hearing from these apologists. And it doesn't go so well for him. And so I want to show you when these arguments are actually trotted out before atheists who know a thing or two, they don't have to know much about the Bible, then the Christian can tend to get destroyed. And that's one of the things that does concern me. So we're going to start here with Michael Shermer. And if you're watching, you'll see the subtitles of this particular video where I tried to, I'll tell you who the Christian apologists are. I think in this first one, I can't remember who it is actually. You'll see it in a second. But Michael Shermer's the atheist, and I think it's Frank Turek. He's talking to Frank Turek, and he brings the classic charge that I just showed you from Christopher Hitchens about slavery, and you'll hear Frank Turek's response, and then you'll hear a number of other Christian apologists responding to this same line of argumentation.
Okay, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and throughout most of the 19th century, most Christians endorsed slavery. Today, none would. So the arguments they made are just like yours. It's objectively correct. It's right. It's good for blacks. It says so in the Bible. It's and so on. They made all these arguments that nobody would make today. Something dramatic happened. Why do you think slavery is wrong now, and why was it okay back 2 centuries ago? What happened biblically or theologically, or did God have a new revelation to somebody and say, you know what, that was a bad idea?
First of all, Old Testament slavery was not race-based forced servitude. It was voluntary means of working off debt or keeping captives from mustering a rebellion. Secondly, slave trading is condemned in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. Thirdly, the Bible teaches that all men are made in the image of God. Slave and master are equally human, protected, and one in Christ. That's throughout both Old and New Testaments. Fourthly, Jesus came to set the captives free. And fifth, Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform. The Old Testament was not ideal. It was forward-looking to a better testament, which is the New.
When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South. And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off his debts, and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case. So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term. This was actually an anti-poverty program. And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working. Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect, he worked for an income, he paid his debts, he kept his family together. And that, to call that slavery is just a gross misrepresentation.
What we have to understand is that the actual type of quote-unquote slavery that God instituted in the Old Testament is nothing like what we understand slavery to be in America. Right. It was actually more like a way for very poor and destitute people to work their way up and out of poverty. So back then, you couldn't just go get a job at Starbucks and get an apartment. People lived in families, they lived together. And so if crops failed, if things happened and you were kind of destitute, what are you going to do? And so if you might borrow from somebody, if you owe somebody, God instituted this system where you could actually go live in their house, work for them for 7 years, and try to pay off your debt. And then at the end of 7 years, they were commanded to let them go with generous gifts of flocks and grain and wine. And so this is a much different type of situation. In fact, it's actually not that it was perfect, but God was working with what they had back then in the cultural time. So it was really a way to protect people, and so that they could not be destitute and just die. They could go live with somebody and essentially work their way up and out of the poverty that they found themselves in. So it's really important to understand it in that context. Now, in the New Testament, it's the Romans, the slavery in the Greco-Roman world was a little bit different. But when we look at the trajectory of Scripture, it's always moving toward people's freedom, right? It's never, in fact, Paul condemned slave traders. Kidnapping human beings in the Old Testament was punishable by death. So you couldn't do that kind of stuff like what we did in America. In fact, it was actually those scriptures that led people like William Wilberforce and others to fight slavery and lead the movement of abolition.
The idea of human rights, the idea of equality and justice and liberation from oppressors, these are deeply biblical ideas. Like you said, in the Old Testament, God chooses a people who were enslaved to obviously liberate them. And then as we get to the New Testament, you have a kind of spiritual liberation as well. So I think that's a really helpful way to frame the question from a 30,000-foot view.
In Luke 4 also, that he has come to bring liberation to the captives.
The word translated slave many times is really referring to servants that are indentured servants. It's an employment relationship that we see in these passages. And the employee, the servant, had union representation. It wasn't like the Wild West, anything goes. There were regulations for the Jews from the Mosaic Law on things related to ebeds. And even so, it's still not ideal, but it was a whole lot better than all the other nations on earth. And eventually, the biblical ethic gave a foundation for abolition. And it was based on Scripture that Christians, both in the UK and in the States, were able to abolish slavery.
The slavery with the Israelites was voluntary servitude.
Okay.
So are you against that?
So first of all, what we're talking about here is that there are two different rules for how to treat Jewish slaves versus how to treat the heathen slaves that you buy from people around you. So that's already a position that is the antithesis of equality, right? And then in Exodus 21, it also tells you how to trick your Jewish slaves so that they become your property forever. So in the same one in the same passage that creates an exemption or an exception for Jewish slaves, it also tells you the loophole of how to get around that. So if you're okay with what the Bible has to say about slavery, then would you be my slave based on what Exodus 21 says?
only
Exodus
if he died.
21, verses 20 and 21. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. And you are advocating that a position where someone, a human being, can be viewed as someone else's property, which can be beaten as long as they're not beaten to death, and you are claiming that you're okay with that.
Well, they're not. It's not okay to beat a slave.
It says it straight.
Okay, well, there you go. That's the video arrangement. I actually just went online this morning. I already knew about one of these clips, but I just thought, you know what? I'm just gonna find a few others from the top apologists. I know what they all say because when I was in college, I was listening to all of these people, maybe with the exception of Elisa Childers, because I don't think she was an apologist at that time, but uh, I don't know what to say. Like you see at the end of that clip how when a Christian who is listening to all these guys tries to take their argument to an atheist and how it goes for him. It doesn't go so good. And just to review before we proceed here, there's the talking points are essentially, and this isn't exhaustive, but what you just heard is that the Bible's against man capture, that the Bible is not race based, that Jesus came to set the captives free, which is, of course, a spiritual meaning, but that now they're going to apply that to this labor relationship. And then it's a welfare safety net. So, that's actually true. That's not, some of these things are true. It's not like they're all not true. And some of them aren't, but, and then of course the Bible promotes abolition. And so the framing is trying to prove to the other side who's saying the Bible promotes or at least doesn't stop slavery. They're trying to get the Bible and get God off the hook by saying, actually, God is on the opposite side of that. God would have been the one inspiring the abolitionists. They were the ones who were truly interpreting scripture correctly. And as we go through this series, probably not in this video, but if we do one maybe next week or the week after, I'm not sure what the schedule looks like, I'll go into the abolitionists a little more and show you that that's not really the case. But what's left out, I think, is more important than what's included, because they don't talk about, at least they don't bring up wartime scenarios and how, yes, man capture is forbade, but you can't take slaves in war. They don't bring up abusing or rather pagan slavery. They tend to bring up just rules for Jewish slavery, especially Jewish people who had sold themselves into slavery because of poverty. So they don't bring up the rules for pagan slaves, which are different. They don't talk about conditions for lifetime or perpetual slavery. They don't address the pagan Roman system, which in many ways was much worse than antebellum slavery that we think about in the American context. And they, of course, they don't address penalties for disobedient or criminal slaves and how those were handled in the Old Testament according to God's law. They avoid all those things and more because it doesn't suit their purpose. And their purpose is to try to, at the end of the day, show that God does not endorse slavery. This is the bottom line of all of it. They're trying to show that God does not endorse, he has no association with, there's no connection, nothing between God and slavery. In fact, just the opposite. God is against slavery. And so they have to frame Hebrew slavery in the Old Testament as not slavery. They have to categorize it and say that that's not slavery, that the Bible translators for years have been getting this all wrong in our English translations, and that it should be translated something else, maybe servant, a word that is not as harsh. And then we can pivot from that to say that the Bible was used, the general spirit, even these spiritual verses, like he came to set the captives free, and that was used by abolitionists to overturn slavery in the United States. Therefore, God is on the side of the good guys in the conflict, or at least who the egalitarian left thinks of as the good guys. And now I would say the neoconservative rights would think the same thing. That was not always the case, but that is now. So that's the framing. That's what you're going to hear across the board. And these are Christian apologists. You got to remember, these are people, I tweeted this out yesterday, and I got some people asking, a lot of people, this is by design on my part, but a lot of people were asking me, John, who are you talking about? Because I said something to the effect of that many of the Christian apologists out there, when they talk about social issues, they are, I'm not talking about like exegetical issues or historical issues, or I'm talking about like social issues, issues that are debated today that are controversial. They become apologists for liberalism, for social liberalism, and they're not really apologists for Christianity anymore. And I had all kinds of people, including Dr. James White, wanting to know, who am I talking about? I gave some hints, but I really was teasing what I just showed you and what I'm going to be talking about today. This is just one of many issues. If I was going to talk about something like feminism, I could have played for you many clips of the same people, probably, or others who are just as popular in the Christian apologetic scene, who would say to you that the Bible is good, the Bible is justified, the Bible is something you should consider because it gave rights to women. And the early women's rights crusaders, some of them use the Bible. It's the same thing. They're trying to promote Christianity by saying it corresponds to your egalitarian ideas of labor relationships or social arrangements. That's why the Bible's good. Not because God is good and God said it was good, and every time it's actually tried, it works. And instead of critiquing our egalitarian society and so how terrible it is and how it claims to provide all these things and it doesn't, we just assume that it actually is good. Then it does provide equality, and that it's God's word that doesn't do it. And the dark ages, when God's word was more revered, are worse. I would submit to you that move in Christian apologetics is a fatal move, and it is the source of, I believe, a lot of people leaving the Christian faith. It's an off-ramp, because as soon as you buy into this other standard beyond Christianity that judges Christianity, then and you do a little research, you'll find out that Christianity doesn't entirely meet that egalitarian standard of equality. So that's the problem stated for you. Now, let me bring you through what I would consider to be the solution to this problem. And at the end, we're going to re-examine that syllogism I gave you at the beginning. But we got to get through some material before we get there. So let's get through some of that material. What is slavery? We got to ask this question first. What is slavery? Well, the Hebrew term refers to labor relationships. So it can be masters and servants, if you want to put it that way. I don't mind if people want to say servants, but I think there's a reason that most Bible translations have said that Ivad means slave. Debt relationships is another one, borrowers and lenders. So that's another relationship there. And I give you scripture on all of these that you can go look up later. I don't have enough time in this video to look up everything, but you can go look it up. Worship relationships, so God and idols, and then people. So you're a slave to the person you worship. You're a slave to the person you're in debt to. You're a slave to the person that you serve in a labor relationship, if certain conditions are met, which I'll describe in a moment. And then, of course, tributary relationships, the dominant and the subservient in national relationships. Those who pay tribute to countries are enslaved by those countries. And then you have civil relationships, finally. So these are 5 different ways that we see this term slave used in the Bible. In the civil relationships, you have rulers and subjects. And so a good example would be Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, this is used, that they were captured by the Babylonians, and so they were slaves to Babylon. Okay, well, these are 5 different relationships, but we're going to zone in on, of course, number 1, the labor relationship. Masters and servants, or masters and slaves. A slave is one who works, and it differs, a slave, from a hired servant in this way. And this is the distinction between, if you really want to get technical, between a servant and a slave. Slaves do not receive wages, okay? Now, they do receive them in the sense that they're provided with room and board and medical attention if they get sick. In most cases, they do have a way to provide, or someone is providing for them. And in some situations, especially as you study American slavery, you'll find that many slaves actually had side hustles that they could, on their own time, work to make their own wages. So there's exceptions, but in general, slave does not receive wages, not for the labor that the expectation is the master is providing other things in substitute for wages. And so it's not wages in the monetary sense like we would think of, not like a day laborer. Number 2, slaves are members of the master's household. Servants are not necessarily. Now, again, you could say in Roman slavery and Greco-Roman slavery, there's some overlap and so forth, but slaves are permanently bound or temporarily bound to the family in a permanent way. And what I mean by that is even the slaves who are freed at Jubilee for that 7-year period, they're not free to go. They're living with you. They're part of the family. They are also legally subject, or I should say they're part of the household, not the family. Excuse me. They may be part of the family in a way that does happen, but they're part of the household. And then number 3, they're legally subject to the master's will within legal boundaries. So there's regulations, and pretty much all society has regulations, whether coming from social pressure or coming from laws, but they are legally subject to the master's will. That's the key. I can quit my job. I can't just quit being a slave. The master has authority over me. I'm subordinate to him. So these are the ways that slavery would differ from being a servant. Now, you could say that effectively my ancestors who came to the United States were indentured servants, many of them, and some of them remained that way until their death. And so you could easily make the case that it's so similar. What's the difference, right? The 1619 Project likes to say slaves came in 1619, but there's good evidence that actually those who came on the Dutch ship to Virginia from Africa were in fact indentured servants as well. And you didn't have slaves yet. So there's some overlap, there's some mixing, but those are the general ways to distinguish, if you will, between a servant and a slave. Now, the ways to become a familial slave, meaning a slave of the household, was you could be born into it. You could also be captured in war. You could also be sold to pay for debt or sell yourself, or you could be sold to make restitution for stealing. There's 4 different ways in the Old Testament to become a slave. Now, the Christian apologists I just played for you only want to talk about one of these, it seems like. They want to talk about selling yourself into slavery to pay for a debt. Well, that is one of 4 different ways you could become a slave. You could be born into it. You didn't have a choice. You could be captured in war. And sometimes you didn't have a choice in that either. And think of the conditions of that. I mean, that's mercy in a way, because in the ancient world, you would just be killed most of the time. And you're not being killed. But, if you're a wife or a child, your husband's likely dead, fought in the war, and now you are the slave of this other people. Or you could be sold, like I said, again, to make restitution for stealing. So this is the criminal element. The penalties for stealing could be slavery. If you didn't have the money, then you become the person's slave if you stole from them. Now, regulations for Hebrew familial slave relationships. There were regulations upon this practice. And let me give you a number of those, okay? Purchased Hebrew slaves could not be held past 6 years unless they chose to perpetually continue the labor relationship with their master on the 7th year, when freed masters were to supply them with provisions, okay? Now, you heard Alyssa Childers there kind of with a broad brush just saying that slavery in the Hebrew context in the ancient world was essentially you selling yourself into slavery and then the master giving you all these gifts. Well, actually, the master is supposed to supply you with provisions, and it's only under this situation, under the conditions that you are a purchased Hebrew slave who cannot be held past 6 years. This is a very specific thing, and it's important to remember this. This is not the entirety of Hebrew slavery here. This is just one specific circumstance. So these are Hebrews that we're talking about here who were purchased. And I shouldn't add, because I just said it, but I should just re-emphasize it, that there's a condition here where this isn't the case. They could also choose to perpetually continue the labor relationship. And if you read Exodus 21, which I'd encourage you to do, it talks about slaves who are, they become the property of their master, Hebrew slaves. And then if their master provides them with a wife, that wife and those children essentially belong to the master. And the husband may choose to become a perpetual slave for the rest of his life of the master for the purpose of not separating the family. But he could just leave, but then the family stays with the master. So again, if that sounds messed up to you, this is what the Bible teaches. And this is what many of the Christian apologists you just heard, they just gloss over it. They don't even talk about it. And this is the best case scenario, right? This is you're a Hebrew slave. Also, purchased Hebrew female slaves who were not married could not be sold to foreigners. Exodus 21:8 talks about this. So there's certain protections based upon gender or sex. And then you have purchased Hebrew female slaves who married their master or his son were legally free if conjugal rights and provisions were withheld. Hebrew slaves who were sold to pay for debt were freed during the year of Jubilee. So every 49 years, I believe it is, you have this year of Jubilee where Hebrew slaves who were sold, and this look, this is another circumstance. These are slaves that were sold to pay for a debt. Because you say, John, I just thought you said that slave masters are supposed to give their Hebrew slaves gifts after 6 years. Yeah, I did say that, but that was in a different scenario. This is a scenario in which the Hebrew slaves were sold to pay for a debt. So in that circumstance, they're freed during the year of Jubilee. And then striking slaves was permitted, but there were consequences for excessive force. In other words, if a slave loses his eye or his tooth, he's freed or she's freed. If a slave doesn't get up after a day or two, I'm trying to remember now. I should probably look up the passage. I looked it up this morning, but there's consequences for the master essentially. So there's regulation upon the force the master is allowed to use, but there is force that is employed. And again, this is in an Old Testament where force is also employed against children who are disobedient, right? The rod of discipline. Proverbs 17 talks about the possibility of slaves who can, and this isn't really a regulation. This is just actually probably doesn't belong in this category, but I didn't know where else to put it. This is just a possibility, and it gives a window into the kind of relationships that existed. It wasn't just simply a brutal subordinate relationship. You actually could share in the inheritance of those who are heirs to the master. Proverbs 17:2. So a slave could share in the inheritance of the wealth of the master. Kidnapping was punishable by death, though slaves could be taken in war, as I mentioned before. You can't just go capture someone and say, you're my slave now. In war, though, in a wartime context, you kind of could, right? It was forbidden to return runaway slaves from pagan nations, Deuteronomy 23. I'm going to expand on this one in a moment because I didn't play you clips of it, but I have heard other apologists talk about this. This a few years ago, actually, I remember someone, I don't think it was someone actually, I was researching 19th century slavery in the United States, and I came across all this literature on the topic. And one of the things I saw was this debate between, I think it was Presbyterians, if I'm not mistaken, Presbyterian pastors on the subject of the sinfulness of slavery. And one of the things they were discussing was that the fugitive slave law in the United States. And one pastor who is an abolitionist was arguing that runaway slaves, that it's biblical to return them because any slave that runs away is automatically free. And the pastor on the other side was saying that's only from pagan nations that were surrounded Israel. And so I looked into it more, and sure enough, it was a very innovative interpretation that the abolitionist was using throughout time. Read John Calvin, read pretty much anyone throughout church history, and then, of course, Hebrew thought that they believe that this was a unique circumstance, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. And then, of course, last but not least, slaves and slaves' offspring from pagan nations or sojourners could be kept in perpetuity, meaning that the year of Jubilee doesn't do anything to free them. Okay. So this whole, it's just 6 years or the year of Jubilee, doesn't apply to them. So and what is that based on? You hear all these Christian apologists saying there's no race-based slavery. Well, this is based on the membership of a foreign nation. If you're a member of a foreign nation, then a different set of rules applies to you. The justice is equal to you. Bible talks about that being the righteous standard is applied to you, but that standard has some certain exceptions, and this is one of them. Or I shouldn't say certain exceptions, but it has built into it a mechanism for handling certain circumstances that a foreigner and a Hebrew should be treated differently on, and this is one of them. Other one would be that Edomites, for example, can't enter the temple. It takes 3 generations to do so of assimilation. There's actually a number of these things. So this is just one of them. So let me just expand real briefly on this harboring runaway slaves from pagan nations idea, because this is used to justify or say that the abolitionists were all correct and of the 19th century. And I again, trying to be biblical here. It's nothing personal, nothing. I'm not trying to, in a clever way, read the Bible to justify those who are anti-abolitionists or for progressive emancipation, which is probably the position I would have held. I'm just trying to show you this is what the Bible teaches, and this is what the common sense way of interpreting it is, and this is what tradition says about it. So Deuteronomy 23:15 says, "You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him." Now, question is, why limit the interpretation of this from pagan nations? Why can't this be the slave next door running to you? Why can't it be that? Well, maybe it can, but the context seems to indicate otherwise. And I'll give you a few reasons for this. Matthew Poole, the Puritan Matthew Poole, gives a couple food for thought ideas about this. First is this: of the servants of strangers, because it follows in Deuteronomy 23:16, he shall dwell with thee even among you, which shows that he had dwelt with and belonged to another people. So there's an assumption here. He wasn't in one of your towns. He wasn't with you, dwelling with you. He was from somewhere else. And that does seem to make sense contextually. And I'll give you another one. There's a common sense element to this. If you could just go next door and now you're freed, that could very easily, if it was that easy to be freed, then this whole society the whole system would just break down. You wouldn't have that system at all. It would be such a weakness in the system that there's no point in having it anymore. Here's another thing that Matthew Poole said. He said, "Of such as belong to the Canaanites or other neighboring nations, because if he had lived in remote countries, it is not probable that he would flee so far to avoid his master, or that his master would follow him so far to recover him." So this is in a specific context where the master is close enough to be able to journey to your towns, so people in Israel, surrounding nation, and what was I going to say? I'm losing my train of thought here. And this is also a circumstance, if that is true, where we're talking about Canaanites. If we're talking about Canaanites, you have to realize the context. The context is this: the Israelites were told to wipe out the Canaanites, and they did not completely do that. Because of that, what happens? Well, this is one of the situations that they are free to, when a slave escapes, keep that slave. All right. So that's one of the ideas here. Now, you can disagree and say that's speculation, perhaps, but it fits. And it makes a whole lot more sense than saying the slave next door could just come over and he's not a slave anymore. Also, tradition. I got to add this to it. The Jewish writers generally understood it of one of the servants of idolaters fleeing for the sake of religion. This is from John Gill. John Gill goes into great detail on this, of all the Hebrew sources in Hebrew tradition that say this. And so it's across the board. It's universal. The Hebrews took it that way. They did not think it was the slave next door or another Hebrew slave. This was from a foreign nation. And I think if you're doing eisegesis, you're trying to impose something that you don't find in the text. I think it's funny because I think some people would accuse me of this, but that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm trying to be true to what the text says. If you read the whole context of Deuteronomy 23, including the verses before verse 15, you'll find that it keeps that it goes back and forth. It'll talk about laws that apply to Jews more narrowly, or that apply to Jews in their personal conduct. But even in those contexts, even in those cases, it's a broad command that applies to all of Israel. And that's what you see over and over. And you get to verse 15, and the context and the wording totally vindicates the idea that this is specific to the nation of Israel, not individual people, individual Israelites who, maybe their slave escaped and is going next door or something like that. So more could be said about that, but I just wanted to kind of make an aside because I know that is a controversial issue there, and give you the reasons that people have thought that this pretty universally up until very recently, that this only applied to pagan nations. Now, conclusions from what I just shared with you. First of all, Hebrew familial slavery existed within the jurisdiction of the family. The jurisdiction of the family. That's important for me to emphasize. We're used to thinking of it more in the jurisdiction of the state. And that's not where it existed. It existed in the jurisdiction of the family. It says in Exodus 20:10, "But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you and your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you." It's your household. And the Abrahamic household was a very common image used in the antebellum period. This is the mark that Christian plantation owners who had slaves were trying to reach for. They wanted to be like Abraham. They wanted to be that's where the term comes from. Eugene Genovese, who's a historian on slavery, probably the premier historian of the 20th century on slavery, talks about this quite a bit. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a relationship that exists kind of organically within a family context, not a rigid relationship regulated by a state where the state, oversees every aspect of it. And no, this is something different than that. It was also connected to covenantal blessings. So no layman, however, is to eat the holy gift, Leviticus 22. A sojourner with the priest or a hired man shall not eat of the holy gift, but if a priest buys a slave as his property with his money, that one may eat of it. Exodus 12, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover, no foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave purchased with money after you've circumcised him, then he may eat of it. Now think about this. I just told you there's these exceptions to the way foreigners are treated. This is one of them. They're not supposed to eat the Passover meal unless what? Unless they're a slave. They get to participate in the covenantal blessings if they are a slave. And that means they're part of the household. So slavery in the Old Testament could be viewed as a blessing in those circumstances if you're a foreign slave coming in to worship the Lord, and now you are able to be a closer participant in that worship. It was regulated and perhaps necessary, but not prescribed. Big key thing here. And this is what one of the things I think some of those apologists I played at the beginning got right. It's not prescribed. God doesn't ever say that you must have this as a feature of your government. Now, for some of the hardcore theonomists, I think this can become an issue in a way, if you think there's just parallels between everything in the Old Testament to whatever the modern context is. Same thing with polygamy. You're not something that's regulated like that. You're free to say that God's intention was one man and one woman, and it's really good that we are in a society that recognizes that, even though we're starting to shift. You can say the same thing about slavery and say it's great that we have personal responsibility more codified in our laws, or at least that's what we want to strive for, and that's the society we would like to have, and so we're striving for that, and that striving is a good thing. You can say that, and even if it is a further regulation than what the Bible places on that particular kind of relationship, or it bans that particular kind of relationship, because the Bible doesn't say you must have that. Now, spiritual slavery is inescapable. You're going to be a slave to God or the devil, but when it comes to labor relationships, it's not necessarily, at least the chattel slavery is not inescapable. You can conceive of a society which doesn't have that, where people are personally responsible. Now, I'm going to argue at the end that I don't know if we've really seen this, that society. We can strive for it, but I think these hierarchies tend to come out in other areas, and I will point out some of those to you at the end, lest you think that we are so superior today than those in the 19th century or those in the ancient world. We're not as superior as you think. And the final conclusion from this is it does not meet the egalitarian standard shared by most Western peoples today. So obviously, slavery falls short of a standard today. And these Christian apologists I played for you are very aware of that. And they want to try to conform the Bible to that standard that comes from the world, essentially. Now, let's talk about Roman slavery. This is one thing the Christian apologists don't tend to want to talk about. And I give you some sources if you want to research this further. S. Scott Bart Key's First Century Slavery in 1 Corinthians 7:21, and then Roman Slavery by Kobe Evans. Roman slavery, Roman citizens could not be slaves. Interesting, huh? They couldn't. So you want to talk about race-based system? Well, this is maybe citizenship-based, but I don't see a big difference as far as there are lines being drawn, and some people are on the in and some people are on the out. And a Roman citizen is on the in. He can't be a slave. Slaves did not have any legal rights. They could not have a real family legally. Okay, so you're a slave, you don't have a real family. It's all your masters. Civil punishments for crime was generally more severe for them than it was for freemen. So we have a standard of justice now that is different for the slaves. Kidnapping to obtain slaves was not uncommon. Now that's in direct violation to Scripture. And masters could kill, rape, and use them for prostitution with social approval. That is a very big difference. That is so different. That is so different than even 19th century slavery in the United States. It's so different. You did not have social approval for these things. Slave traders were looked down upon in 19th century America. You did not have gladiatorial arenas in Alabama. That was viewed as evil thing, or at best, a dirty thing to be involved with. And of course, in the ancient world, though, this is just the way life goes. And then, of course, gladiators were forced to fight to death for entertainment with social approval. Those were slaves. Now, this is the conditions of the New Testament. The Septuagint employs doulos to translate the Hebrew word for ivad. So the Hebrew word for slave, translated slave, it has a parallel in the New Testament, and it's doulos. And so the people who want to say, like Frank Turek and Alicia Childers and others who say, it's not even slave, it should be servant. Well, you're going to have to change possibly the word in the New Testament as well. And we're going to have to get rid of slavery in the New Testament. And I just described for you the Roman slave system. So are you prepared to say that they weren't slaves too? Because if you do that, that's what you're going to have to eventually do. You're going to have to say, well, Roman slaves weren't even slaves. Well, that makes no sense. The conditions for them were worse than the conditions for 19th century slaves in the United States. So that's why that logic is so terrible. But it's the highest levels of our Christian apologetics industry adopt this kind of thing. And it's frankly embarrassing. And nothing personally against any of those people. I'm sure they're well-meaning. But it's just surprising that they would employ that kind of logic when that's supposed to be their expertise. Jesus did not condemn Roman slavery directly during his time on earth. He did incorporate slavery into some of his parables. So the parable of the unforgiving slave, Matthew 18, the parable of the landowner, Matthew 21, the parable of the slave's duty, Luke 17, and the parable of the watchful slaves in Matthew 24, all invoke the slave imagery. And Jesus appealed to the corporal punishment as an acceptable way of administering justice. So you say, hey, in Old Testament slavery, there was corporal punishment, but hey, we've expanded past that in the New Testament. Well, Jesus is still talking about it in parables in the New Testament and not condemning it. The Apostle Paul returned Onesimus, a slave who ran away, to Philemon, who likely hosted the church of Colossae in his home. So you have someone very prominent in the early church, Philemon, and Onesimus is a runaway slave, essentially. Some try to distinguish between he's not a runaway. He's just someone who's escaping because he was abused or something. Well, you're trying to split hairs. He's a slave who escaped, whatever. He's ran away. He left. And Paul ran into him. And then Paul does what? Returns him. And then the New Testament regulates slavery on a personal level in a pagan slave system. So the New Testament regulations are not to be applied. It actually doesn't even offer regulations for governments to apply. It just gives regulations in a pagan slave system, how as Christians are supposed to operate. Now, I want to just say something briefly about Philemon. I was reading this book, Esau McCulley, Reading the While Black. I think it's actually Reading the Bible. Isn't it Reading the Bible While Black? Well, reading the Bible While Black, I think, African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And he has a whole section on Philemon, and this is what he says. He says, I want to argue that Paul does two things that undermine slavery in this passage. Number one, Paul transforms social relationships and status in light of Christ. And number two, Paul requests that Philemon free Onesimus. Okay, so let me examine these two closer. Esau McCulley says that Paul uses familial language, calling Philemon his brother. The point is clear. Oneness in Christ transforms relationships. Society values those with power and status. Now, of course, this would be like saying, Paul also calls people who aren't his kinsmen according to the flesh, whom he valued highly, his brothers in Christ. Therefore, you don't have these fleshly relationships anymore. That doesn't make any sense. But that's his first point. He says that this idea that slaves and masters are family undermines slavery. And then he says, I contend that God intended to use Paul's familial depiction of Christianity to put exactly that type of pressure on the church to redefine and abolish the institution. Now, look, I do think that when you are worshiping with someone, you're in close proximity to them and you work with them. Think about even in modern context, you treat them nicer. That relationship perhaps changes. And there's no argument there, obviously. But to say that this was Paul trying to undermine the labor relationship itself and to dismantle this hierarchy, that's just speculation. And then he says, he quotes a guy named Raymond Brown, who's a New Testament scholar. And Raymond says, a Christian slave owner to defy the conventions, to forgive and receive back into his household a runaway slave, to refuse financial reparation when it is offered, mindful of what one owes to Christ as proclaimed by Paul, to go farther in generosity by freeing the servant, and most important of all, from a theological viewpoint, recognizes in Onesimus a beloved brother and thus acknowledges his Christian transformation. The key being that Paul is asking Onesimus or I'm sorry, asking Philemon to free Onesimus. This is, again, just an assumption. I don't even need to go to commentaries or tradition. Just read the passage. The whole thing. It says in verse 8, therefore, though I have enough confidence in Christ to order you to do what is proper, yet for love's sake, I appeal to you. So from the beginning, Paul is saying to Philemon, I'm going to let you do what you want to do. I'm appealing to you. I could command you, but I'm appealing to you to take this slave Onesimus back. And then he says, Onesimus was formerly useless to you, but now is useful both to you and to me. I have sent him back to you in person. So he's useful. Useful in what way? Well, I mean, from context, you'd assume this means he's useful spiritually to Paul and useful for work as well, or what he was doing before. And he says, I've sent him back. And he says, but without your consent, I did not want to do anything so that your goodness would not be in effect by compulsion. So he's saying, I prefer to keep Onesimus with me, but I'm not going to do that without your consent. And why would that be? How would Philemon have some kind of a claim on Onesimus, which is what Paul's saying? You have a claim on him. I can't just keep him. He can't just stay here and minister with me because you have a claim on him. Verse 15, for perhaps he was for this reason separated from you for a while, that you would have him back forever. Okay, so that doesn't sound like freeing. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave. So that doesn't sound like he's saying free him. It sounds like he's saying he's more than just a slave. He's a beloved brother. Verse 17, if then you regard me as a partner, accept him as you would me. But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. So Paul's saying, I'm willing to take financial responsibility for him, accept him as you would me. In what sense? Well, in the sense of he's a Christian brother now. So there's two things going on in this. He's a Christian brother, and there's also you have a claim. And there's a financial claim there. I'm not expecting you to just forgive that, Paul's saying. And verse 21, having confidence in your obedience, I write to you since I know that you will do even more than what I will say. And people want to read into this, you will do more than I will say, that it's freedom for Onesimus. Oh, you're just speculating at this point, and it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing, and the atheists know it. The atheists capitalize on this, and they just make a mess out of us when we try to sell them on the idea that this is some kind of an anti-slavery document. You could say that it undermines the idea that slaves are just property, or the idea that slaves are not people, or that you should treat slaves like animals. You could certainly say that, and maybe that does undermine the Roman slave system in some ways, but it is certainly not an undermining. That's not Paul's purpose, to undermine that hierarchical relationship itself. He's not making a universal decree against slavery, and he could have done it. Jesus could have done it, and they didn't. And so you have to deal with this, right? And this is part of my attempt in this video to deal with that problem, which is what I'm heading towards. So I just remind everyone, I'm not saying I'm people say I'm a slavery apologist. I'm not a slavery apologist. I don't want slavery. Good riddance to it. But I have reasons to not make mincemeat out of the scripture in my arguing that point, and which I will argue for you at the end. Okay, so personal regulations for familial slavery in the New Testament. What were the regulations? Obedience on the part of slaves. That's number one. Colossians 3, slaves, obey your earthly masters. Titus 2, urge slaves to be subject to their own masters in everything. Then, of course, you have justice on the part of the masters. The masters are also regulated. They're to grant their slaves justice and fairness. They're to be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling. Focus on spiritual identity. There's a focus on the spiritual identity of the slaves and masters, which we just talked about in Philemon. You also see it in 1 Timothy 6. All who are under the yoke as slaves are to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. Those who have believers as their masters must not be disrespectful to them because they are brothers or sisters, but must serve them all the more. So if your master's a Christian, be more enthusiastic about serving, is what Paul's saying, because those who partake of the benefit are beloved and beloved, believers and beloved. Teach and preach these principles. And then number 4 here, kidnapping was prohibited, just like it was in the Old Testament. Immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, 1 Timothy 1. So you have the regulations coming in on the personal level, not on the governmental level, but on the personal level in the New Testament. Now, there are some frequently misunderstood passages that I want to bring before you. First is referring to spiritual enslavement to the law, as if it's referring instead to labor relationships. Galatians 5:1 says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." That's not talking about labor relationships. That's talking about spiritual slavery. Romans 8:15, "For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons by which we cry out, Abba, Father." Again, same thing. And then you have passages referring to spiritual identity. There's neither Jew nor Greek, nor there's neither slave nor free man. There's neither male nor female. You're all one in Christ. Well, this doesn't mean that slavery, that this isn't an anti-slavery passage, no more than it is an anti-gender passage. You know, Paul's not arguing for transgenderism or gender as a spectrum. He's not saying there's no more gender. So you can't use that passage to say there's no more labor relationship. 1 Corinthians 7, "Each man must remain in what condition in which he was called. Where were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men, brethren. Each one is to remain with God in the condition in which he was called." So what's the point of the passage? Spiritual identity. Hey, if you're able to become free, do it. Good. But the passage is not about let's make slavery illegal. All the slaves can be freed. Slavery is sinful. None of that. In fact, at the end, that you're to remain in the condition that God that God called you in. It's about spiritual identity, and it's often twisted to mean some egalitarian crusade against labor relationships of certain kinds. Same thing you just heard from numerous people in that clip about Jesus came to set the captives free. What kind of captives are we talking about? Obviously, he didn't in his parables. Then, there seems to be a contradiction, and you're setting the atheists up to destroy you, because they're going to point out that Jesus talks about slave labor, and in talking about slave labor, he has even corporal punishment involved in that. How does that jive with him setting the captives free? Because he's setting them free from spiritual bondage. That's why. Okay, some conclusions. The Roman slave system did not operate according to God's law. In other words, what I just read you from the Old Testament that regulated slavery, it was not operational in the New Testament under Roman slavery. Christ and the apostles did not come to oppose the concept of slavery. And they did not oppose the concept of slavery. You don't find it. The apostles taught Christians to regulate themselves within a practice governed by pagan assumptions. Number 4, the New Testament introduced a focus and concern on the spiritual condition of both slaves and masters. And then number 5, the New Testament treatment of slavery does not align with modern egalitarian assumptions. All right, so those are some of the conclusions that I draw from that. Now, slavery in a broad sense is somewhat going to be with us. And Proverbs 12:24 gets at this. The hand of the diligent will rule, but the hand of the slack will be put to forced labor. Slavery. We're talking about slavery there, essentially. You're going to be put to forced labor. Why? Because you're of a certain caliber. You're not diligent. You don't have the virtue to govern yourself. Someone else will govern you if you want to eat. That's how this works. Aristotle famously called some men slaves by nature who possessed reduced mental capabilities and benefited from the directions and limitations imposed by others. This is a hard pill to swallow. Okay. And I think that even in our society, in fact, especially in our society, now that it's getting, I'd say, worse in so many ways, we have people that aren't able to regulate themselves. They're going to need limitations put upon them. I don't believe in, and I wouldn't want to bring some kind of a chattel system to bear, but there's going to, and I have reasons I'll explain at the end, but there are going to have to be mechanisms whereby people are regulated, because if they're not, they will not just hurt themselves, they will hurt other people. They will form gangs. They will be criminal. And a welfare system, unfortunately, right now enables this kind of thing. Here's the fundamental truth. Labor hierarchies are inevitable. You're going to have them. Slave labor relationships likely existed before Noah, according to Genesis 9:25, and characterized the ancient and much of the pre-modern world. Equality in status is not achievable except when all are equally judged by God. Isaiah 24:1-3 says, "Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, and the servant like his master, and the maid like her mistress, and the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word." At the foot of the cross, all men are going to be equal. The church gives a taste of that when you come into church. There's a taste of this. All men can come to the communion table. But it doesn't eliminate in a temporal world these kinds of distinctions. Accepting this principle caused pre-modern people to evaluate labor relationships based more on condition than status. So they looked at the world they were in and say, what's best? Not what makes us most equal, which is the question that everyone today asks, and they'll judge me by it in this video. They'll judge everyone by it. Are you for equality or not? It doesn't matter if we're equally miserable. Are you for equality? In the past, up until recently, people generally judge their societies based on condition. What are the best conditions socially, even in our labor relationships, that we can have that are suited to our situation, so people can have the highest level of living? And it may not be, given the weaknesses of a particular culture, it may not be that they have the option. I think in the Old Testament, you probably didn't have the option of not having some kind of a slave labor system. We do have more of an option today because of automation and other things. And I'll get into that a little bit at the end. Now, what about slavery in America? Now, I'm going to be brief with this. There's so much I want to share that I can't. And this maybe inspire me to do a whole nother podcast on the abolitionists and on the arguments and denominations preceding the Civil War over the question of abolitionism, which was the controversy. Slavery wasn't the controversy so much as abolitionism was the controversy. And what I mean by that is the abolitionists wanted to force an immediate end to slavery. And frankly, what I would consider, and I agree with Sandy Mitcham on this, in irresponsible ways. Sandy Mitcham talked about this in the 1607 project that I just put out. If you, or I should say, Abbeville Institute just put out. If you want to go on YouTube and check it out. But they didn't want to integrate slaves into society. They didn't want to compensate masters for slaves that the Northeasterners had sold them, because they were the ones involved in the shipping industry that brought the slaves here. They just wanted them freed, and it would be severe economic and social consequences to doing so. And they said the South could just deal with that. So it was a terrible situation. And that's the context that we're in. That's the abolitionism debate, if you will, in a nutshell. There's more that could be said. But slavery, the practice of one person owning another as property, according to the Lexham Bible Dictionary. And they say, or one person owning debt to another and repaying that debt via slave labor, via their labor, I should say. In the ancient Near East, the Greco-Roman world, and the Old and New Testaments. No single description of slavery fits the various forms it took in the ancient world. However, and get this, listen to this. This is the Lexham Bible Dictionary. It was quite different from the slavery practice in the West during the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay, I'll grant you there's differences, but you just summarized Roman slavery and Hebrew slavery and Greek slavery. You thousands of years of history were just they were flattened into that's one kind of slavery, and then American slavery is a different kind. The slavery in the West is a different kind. Really? I just explained to you the difference between Hebrew and Roman. So they're more close to each other, apparently, than slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm telling you, 100% this fits a political motive. This is what I shared with you at the beginning. It's the apologists and the scholars trying desperately to get away from, get the Bible off the hook, get God off the hook, to get away from charges that they would support or be any way connected to slavery of any kind that we think of, and to create that distance as big as possible between those forms of slavery and American slavery, because American slavery, we know, apparently was the most evil, horrible system of slavery that's ever been invented in the entire world. And granted, there were some terrible things I'm going to share with you, but nowhere near some of the other slave systems that existed, whether in the Arab world or the Roman world or other places. Easton's Bible Dictionary says slave, a Hebrew and Greek words for slave are usually simply servant or bondman or bondservant. So again, they're trying to couch it in, it's not really slavery. Slavery as it existed under the Mosaic Law has no modern parallel. That law did not originate, but only regulated an already existing form of slavery, which you could say the same thing, by the way, for antebellum slavery, but I digress. The gospel in its spirit and genius is hostile to slavery in every form, which under its influence is gradually disappearing from among men. And this is Easton's Bible Dictionary. Yes, the gospel is hostile to slavery in every form. There's no Bible verse. This is exegetically inane, but an atheist will destroy you if you try to trot this out on a college campuses. But we got Christians in this country eating this up. And then we send them out to do missionary work on college campuses, and we wonder why they get eaten up. We wonder why the atheists seem more compelling sometimes. It's because of this stuff. This is ridiculous. Let me give you some misconceptions before we continue about American slavery. Slavery formed organically. There wasn't a law of people who came together and voted in 1619, we're going to have slavery. No, it's just happened organically over time. And once you did have mechanisms in place able to end it, the problem, and I will say problem, was much bigger. The slave markets in sub-Saharan Africa already existed. Arabs removed 28 million people over 14 centuries, whereas Europeans removed 12 million people in 4 centuries. So if you want to really get on someone's case, culturally, the Arabs are much more to blame, just by numbers. What became the United States, or the American slave system, affected every region of the United States, not just the South. Okay, Jonathan Edwards had slaves. Slaves existed down the road from me. Right now, where I'm sitting is the Hudson River. There is a place, and there's a slave cemetery right less than a mile from my house, less than half a mile from my house. There's a slave cemetery. I don't think the people in New York really like others to know it's there. I know about it because I'm a local, and I'm one of the few people who probably know about it. But it is labeled, and there's even a sign that's an old sign of the Yelverton House, and that particular house on the Hudson River, that is where slaves scullied the ferry. This happened. This was across the board. This is one of the reasons the Hudson River Valley joined the American Revolutionary cause, because the British in New York City were a sanctuary for slaves. They said, if you join and escape to our lines, you're freed. And this was one of the main things that turned people in the Hudson River Valley in New York against the British. And when the British left New York, George Washington wrote a letter and said, I think you have something that belongs to us. So I don't want to go into more detail. I could, but this is something that the 1619 Project capitalizes on. And we're very stupid if we try to just say, well, none of that happened. No, there were things like that happened. And the North is just as complicit as the whole country is complicit, because that's where the shipping was. That's the ports that sent the slave ships out were in the North primarily. Slave trading was generally looked down upon. The slave trade was outlawed when a general government formed in the South. And before even the Confederacy, you had, by 1808, the slave trade was to cease, although it didn't. New York was still taking in slaves in its port. Conditions preserving slave-master relationships were generally not thought to be perpetual. In other words, that slavery was eventually going to end. This was a common assumption in the United States. Only 4% of the slaves transported in the transatlantic slave trade came to the U.S. So 96% of the slaves that came from sub-Saharan Africa to the New World were in other countries other than the United States. But who bears the brunt? The United States. Almost 4,000 Black people owned almost 13,000 slaves in 1830. So you had a bunch of Black people, thousands of them, who owned slaves themselves. So these all crash the narrative that you're given, that a bunch of white Christians dream this up and then forcibly, captured people and kept them. And this is a entirely white Christian operation. It is not. It never was. This is so much bigger than that. And if you put it in its context, you will find that those in the Bible Belt in the United States probably treated their slaves conditionally better than many of the other places they went, including think about the Muslim world. You don't even have a lasting, all those people I just talked about, 28 million. Where are they? Where are they in the Arab world? Well, they weren't allowed to procreate. They weren't allowed, their populations were not allowed to increase. And that's why they're not there. And in the United States, they prospered in that way. I'm not saying that everything was hunky-dory at all, as I'll explain in a moment. But I'm saying when you're comparing this to other non-Christian peoples, and that's really, you want to compare apples and apples if you're going to make that comparison. So Christianity did somewhat pacify what could have been something much worse. The African slave markets, according to John Thornton in Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, we must accept, he says, that African participation in the slave trade was voluntary. And under the control of African decision makers, this was not just at the surface level of daily exchange, but even at deeper levels. Europeans possessed no means, either economic or military, to compel African leaders to sell slaves. If you want to go to the beginning of where this whole thing started, if you want to start at the beginning, you're talking about Africans. The supply chain starts with Africans, and much of this was war between Africans. Again, now, was man capture part of this? I'm sure it was. And many of those in the 18th century who were gradual emancipationists, even who weren't abolitionists, granted that man capture was part of much of this, but there was also a lot of warfare involved in this. It was a messy situation. And it's a knot that's so tangled, you can't untangle it. That's one of the foolhardy things about reparations. There's no untangling this. And if those who are going to pay it should be the ones who are at the beginning of the supply chain, of course, we don't go to them. Here's where slavery became legal. 1655, there was a case, not 1619, 1655. Court records in 1641 indicate that Anthony, a guy named Anthony, was master to a black servant, John Casser. And Casser would become the first person to be arbitrarily declared a slave for life in the U.S. in 1655 in a court case. Anthony's neighbor, and I think it's Anthony Johnson. I don't know why I didn't put that, but it's Anthony Johnson. His neighbor and white planter Robert Parker had momentarily secured Casser's freedom after he had convinced Parker and his brother George that he was illegally detained and indentured servant. So here you have a white guy saying, yeah, you're free. And you have this black master, Anthony Johnson, saying, no, you're not. And this is how we started a legal precedent for slavery, with a black master. Anthony Johnson fought to retain ownership of Casser in a lengthy court battle, and he won. John Punch, an African, was declared a slave for life as punishment for trying to escape his indentured servitude in an earlier case, but Casser was the first to be declared a slave for life as a result of the suit. And then we have the picture of, this is, I think it's called Whipped Peter, or I'm trying to remember the name. I think Gordon is the other name for this particular slave on the left. You see this. I mean, I went to the Booker T. Washington National Historic Household in Virginia, and they had a picture of this guy, of Gordon, with his back all, torn up, which is terrible. Salt was put in his wounds. A horrible story. Abolitionists made use of this during and before the Civil War to try to portray slavery as the worst possible thing, and that this is just what slavery is. But even, I thought it was interesting because Booker T. Washington talks about when they were freed, they went up to the plantation house and they wept with their master because they were sad to leave him. And they didn't have these conditions on that plantation. In fact, many plantations did not have these conditions. This was very much the exception. And yet this is what's brought up as, it was across the board. The Christian white people did this kind of thing. It would be like showing the picture of an abused wife and saying, this is what Christian husbands do. They abuse their wives, and it all looks like this. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the same thing. Harriet Beecher Stowe had no experience with slavery. She was getting it from stories, travel journals, and so forth. It was a fantasy in a way. I mean, it was historical fiction, if you want to call it that. But Southerners resented these depictions because they said it's not accurate. That's not what's going on. There were horrible things, obviously. Bill Collins, an Alabama slave born in 1846, said this: "My master was so cruel to his slaves that they were almost crazy at times. He would buckle us across a log and whip us until we were unable to walk for 3 days. On Sunday, we would go to the barn and pray to God to fix some way for us to be freed from our mean masters." I mean, absolutely heartbreaking, absolutely horrible. This kind of stuff really did happen. The question is, was this across the board characterized? Did this characterize Christians across the board who were involved in this? That's the question, or at least one of the questions, and one of the important ones to ask. 1863. Here's some depictions you're not going to see in the official narratives that you get from the regime today. Family worship at a plantation in South Carolina. And who do you see in the place of either reading the scripture or exhorting the congregation, who is white and black, a black preacher? Here's another one. I took this picture. You can't find it online. I took it at the North Carolina Museum of History when I was there. And there were a bunch of things like this, a bunch of pictures like this, depicting black and white black slaves with well-dressed, with their friends who were white right next to them in pictures, in family pictures, endearing pictures. This kind of thing happened. You got to square your cartoon image with these depictions as well. Here's some more of slaves, and these are household slaves, I believe, with the family that they served. And you even have their children, dressed in the same way, wearing the same kind of clothes. Here's another one of a black boy with a white girl, and I was reading in Eugene Genovese's book, Rule Jordan Rule, that actually slaves did not even work generally before they were 12 years old and throughout their teens. And this is when the white kids are also doing work. Their work is fairly light. So this was just the culture. And so, yeah, of course, they would be friends and playing with the people that their own parents are helping to take care of, and vice versa. Here's a depiction from this is from the Works Project Administration, I believe, slave narratives, and you can go read those. I would suggest you do. I've read many of them. And this is Mrs. Maria Hines, born in 1835 in Southampton County, Virginia, owned or her labor was owned by James Pessman on his plantation. And here's what she says. Not only was master good, but his whole family was. When the weather was good, we worked in the field and on other little odd jobs that needed to be done. We slaves would eat our breakfast and go to the fields. There won't no hurry scurry. Lots of times when we got in the fields and the other slaves had been in the field a long time, there were times, though, we had to get to it early, too, especially if it had been rainy weather and the work had held up for a day or so. Master didn't make us work at all in bad weather, neither when it got real cold. The men might have to get in firewood or supping of that sort, but not all day work in the cold, just little odd jobs. We didn't even have to work on Sundays, not even in the house. The master and the preacher both said it was the Lord's day. You weren't supposed to work on that day, so we didn't. We cook the white folks victuals on Saturday, and lots of times they eat cold victuals on Sunday. Master would sometimes ask the preacher home to dinner. You plenty welcome to go home with me for dinner, but you'll have to eat cold victuals, because there ain't no cooking on Sundays at my house. Lots of times, we slaves would take turns on helping him serve Sunday meals, just because we liked them so much. We hated to see Missy fumbling around in the kitchen, all out of place. We didn't have to do it. We just did it of our own free will. Master sometimes gives us a little money to do it, which made it all the better. Master and Mrs. was so good to us, we didn't mind working a little on Sundays in the house. Master had prayer with the whole family every night, prayed for us slaves too. Any of the slaves that wanted to join him could. Or if he wanted to pray by themselves, they could. And she goes on. And I want to ask you straight up, is the description you see here of the way that a Christian master treated his slaves, does it suggest to you that this man was in sin, that he was maybe even irredeemable, that you're going to see him in hell, that he's the worst kind of person because he was in this labor relationship? Or does the way he treated these slaves speak something about the relationship itself? That's a question you have to ask. And if you've never been exposed to these stories, you need to ask yourself why. The slave narratives, like I just described, there's 2,000 of them that the Works Project Administration has, over 2,000. In Time on the Cross, Nobel Prize winner Robert Fogel demonstrated that nowhere in the Western Hemisphere were slaves better treated and cared for than in the South. And after studying the slave narratives, Fogel concluded that 60 to 80% of all respondents had only positive things to say about their masters in their life during slave days. I'm just the messenger. I'm just telling you what these narratives indicate. Now, that also means that 20 to 40% had some bad things to say, and some of them really bad, I'm sure. But to say that this was the whole institution is inaccurate. In 1850, the U.S. Census reported that 1 out of every 1,000 white persons was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. In northern states, 1 out of every 506 black persons. For Southern blacks, it was 1 out of 1,464 who possessed such inabilities. In 1860, the Southern black population was shown to have increased by 23%, while the Northern black population only increased 1.7%. So the U.S. Census data also seems to indicate that the Southern slaves population was prospering. Now, of course, historians today will just go back and say, oh, it was all biased. I mean, that's really what they say, just sweeping generalizations. It was all biased. And the slave narratives, you can't trust them. I've read this stuff. By the way, these things, these arguments are insane in my mind. They would just destroy all history, because it's like, basically they're saying it doesn't fit our narrative, so you can't trust it. Foreign observers like Alex de Tocqueville and James Silk Buckingham and Frederick L. Olmsted all made conclusions about slave conditions that are disqualified from most modern academia, basically saying, like Buckingham said things like, the slaves in the South are treated better than the servants, or rather the laborers of England, things like that. Now, did racism always justify American slavery? This is a question worth asking. It's possible that, I'll just give you a few things to think about. R.T.U. Carrier, who whipped Gordon, the guy with all the whips on his back, and I think, who was it that did a movie about this? I haven't seen it, but there's a movie recently, I think on Apple, that depicted this slave supposedly, but I understand it's somewhat inaccurate. Will Smith played Gordon. Anyway, it's possible that the guy who beat him that way and put salt in his wounds was actually slave himself, was an overseer who was also a slave, or a driver, perhaps. We don't know. But the name Artayu suggests that it doesn't sound like this is necessarily someone with an English first name. Captain John Lyons, was the slave master, and he dismissed Artayu Carrier when that happened. And so this was one of the just unusual, to our ears at least, arrangements that existed on plantation life. You'd have slaves who were in charge of essentially disciplining other slaves. And that may have been what happened to Gordon. Now, in 1860, 171 black slave owners in South Carolina were there. Native Americans owned thousands of black slaves as well. Yet almost 4,000 black people owned almost 13,000 slaves in 1830. William Ellison was one of the largest slaveholders in Charleston at the outbreak of the Civil War. So this really does poke a hole a little bit in this idea that racism always justified slavery. Now, did it justify slavery often? I think it did. In fact, well, I won't go into it, but yeah, there are situations where it did. But it didn't always justify it. And I think it's important for people to realize that there were many exceptions to this. Really, when people say it's a race-based system, it was more of a system based upon the availability of labor. That's where labor was. It was in Africa. It was available. The slave markets were already set up. It was easy to get this labor, and you had a new country that needed labor. And so you had these people from Europe and from the Northeast, especially, going out with their boats to sell. It was profitable to sell these people that were captured by their fellow Africans. So it was more based upon that. But then, yeah, did it become justified based on race? Yeah, you can find writings that certainly show that. There's Gordon again, William Ellison. There's him and how well he's dressed, one of the largest slave owners outside of Charleston. Now, there's a providential view of this, and I tend to be sympathetic to this view. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I would suggest reading it, Up from Slavery by George Washington. I keep saying George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington. He talks about, and I'm just going to summarize what he says, that, I don't like the fact that we had slavery, but look what the Lord did in bringing about a people who did not know the gospel into dialogue with people who did, and they were evangelized, and look at the good that has come from this. That's Booker T. Washington, not me, saying this. And so this is a providential view. Slavery in the Christian South, a lot of things I could show you on this, but let me just show you a few. White ministers emphasized oral instruction, memorization, interrogatories, and singing in their efforts to Christianize the slaves. Slaves memorized the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, many aspects of the denomination's liturgy. Ministers, bishops, and masters often questioned the slaves to make sure they understood what had been taught. And when it came to join a church, slaves exercised their own choice, demonstrating their autonomy. So they could join Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, Baptists, Methodists. And this is in John Blassingame's book, The Slave Community, which is another book I would recommend to you. In an address to Christians throughout the world by the Convention of Ministers as a primary source in Richmond in 1863, you had a number of ministers, 96 of them, who came together to appeal to Christians in other parts of the world to join the Confederate cause. And this is what they said. Most of us have grown up from childhood among the slaves. All of us have preached to and taught them the word of life, have administered to them the ordinance of the Christian church, sincerely love them as souls for whom Christ died. We go among them freely and know them in health and sickness, in labor and rest, from infancy to old age. We are familiar with their physical and moral conditions and alive to their interests, and we testify in the sight of God that the relation of master and slave among us, however we may deplore abuses in this, as in other relations of mankind, is not incompatible with our holy Christianity, and that the presence of the Africans in our land is an occasion of gratitude on their behalf before God, seeing that thereby divine providence has brought them where missionaries of the cross may freely proclaim to them the word of salvation. And the work is not interrupted by agitating fanaticism. That's a reference to the abolitionists. The South had done more than any other people on earth to Christianize the African race. The condition of slaves here is not wretched, as Northern fictions would have men believe, but prosperous and happy. So this is what they're saying. They're saying people like Samuel Davies are going around and slaves are getting saved. People who were involved in animism and pagan African religions are turning to the Lord. And it's because of this is providential view. It's not, and people today will say, well, that just justifies slavery. They're not saying that this justifies the whole institution. They're saying that the Northern, or the abolitionists, I should say, it's not Northern, the abolitionists, what they call fanatics, and what they say about this is not true. The conditions are not what they say, which is what most of the attacks were. And this is not incompatible. The way that we're trying to deal with it is not necessarily incompatible with Christianity. Now, the trajectory of slavery was, I believe it was on its way out. And I know this is a controversial thing. There are economic historians who say, hey, it was really profitable. It wasn't on its way out. And that is true, that it was profitable. And you can debate whether or not automated mechanisms and inventions were going to, like the cotton gin and so forth, were going to change this. They were. But I take a little bit of a different approach. I think there's a social argument to be made here. And many scholars agree with me. I know Don Livingston gave a talk years ago along these lines, that the South had the moral will to end the practice. And so what they'll say is that there were organic corrections that were being applied before and during the Civil War. And let me give you some of those. In 1827, there were more than 4 times as many anti-slavery societies in the South as in the North. And that diminished to about 0 on the eve of war because of the postal crisis, where Northern abolitionists flooded the South with these tracts, many of them advocating even violent uprisings among the slaves. And the South was fearful of that. They saw what happened in places like Haiti. They saw Nat Turner's rebellion. So slavery, those anti-slavery societies diminished, but that didn't mean that the population wasn't also still thinking that there would be some kind of a gradual emancipation. There just was no plan for it. There was no way to negotiate with people in the North who didn't want compensation integration, and they didn't want slaves in the Western territory. So that was the political situation. But the moral will was there. The major slavery-related question that led to deep Southern states seceding involved allowing states into Western territories, which prevented Thomas Jefferson's diffusion solution. The diffusion solution, for those who don't know, was Thomas Jefferson said, if we give slaves an amount of, we let them go to the Western territories, give them land, this is sort of, I guess, eventually you could say the 40 acres and a mule was supposed to kind of be this, but it was supposed to be in a place of their own where they could take ownership unmolested by white people who admittedly look down on this foreign group of people in their minds. They could gain some kind of freedom from that. And this was a way to diffuse slavery and weaken it. That was prevented from happening because of really the Republican Party and the people who were the constituents of the Republican Party wanting those states for free white labor. And so that was an avenue that was closed, but it doesn't mean that the moral will wasn't there to somehow ameliorate, end this institution in a gradual way. Judicially, crimes by slaves were increasingly tried in court, while punishments for mistreating them were also heard. Culturally, there were growing efforts to reform the slave system. And then legally, there were limitations placed on slavery and growing opportunities for freedom. Here's just a few judicially. Here's a picture of Eugene Genovese there. And these come from his book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, where he talks about these court cases where slaves are treated like humans, where masters are in trouble for mistreating their slaves and so forth. This was happening at an increasing level. I think Marshall DeRosa writes about this as well, that increasingly slaves had this political representation or legal representation. I'm not saying it was across the board. I'm just saying that this was growing. Culturally, you also have the slave codes starting to be challenged. Richard Fuller talks about this in, this was before the Civil War. He says that in South Carolina, there were these laws forbidding slaves to assemble without the presence of white persons. He says, though, it's dead letter. No one enforces it. It's archaic. It's like laws against blasphemy today. No one enforces them. He talks about missionaries that are preaching to the slaves all over the place. They have the freedom to do this. He talks about the most important law, that is forbidding slaves being taught to read, yet how many are being taught? Basically saying that it's not enforceable. And that's why I put a picture of Stonewall Jackson, a depiction of Stonewall Jackson honoring him in a black church in Roanoke, Virginia, where some of the people he taught to read the Bible went and planted a church. And then that is, from what I understand, still there. And And so, he had his Sunday school. He, one of the big generals fighting for the Confederacy, but he disregarded that law, thought it was unjust, and a lot of people did too. So should they have been repealed? Sure. But were they basically disregarded? Yeah. And why were they there? This is the most important point. Why were they there? Well, this is what Richard Fuller says, and he's a pastor. He said that the incendiary publications with which the South had just been deluged, that's the postal crisis, works appealing to the worst passions of the slave. Well, what he's talking about are they didn't want slaves to read and to gather together and read these pamphlets that were being flooded down south, encouraging them to rebel, encouraging insurrections, that kind of thing. That's why these laws were in place. And it doesn't justify it. They shouldn't have been in place, but that's why they were there. Eugene Genovese points out that pastors like Richard Fuller, who I just was reading from, Methodists like H.N. McIntyre, George Foster Pierce, Episcopalian, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, among others, pushed to revise the slave codes. He says in Roll Jordan Roll, demands grew to validate slave marriages, to prevent the separation of families, to permit the education of slaves, to protect slaves against cruelty and inhumanity, and to even to admit black testimony against whites in court. Now, legally, the Confederate Constitution outlawed the importation of slaves of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States. In other words, you could go between states, but you cannot bring any more in. So this was still happening even after 1808, but in certain places, but they made it illegal in that Constitution. And then you also have in 1865, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, granted freedom to slaves willing to fight for the Confederacy. So there was a plan in place to free slaves, and this would have totally undermined it. So was the moral will there to end slavery? It was. I believe it was there, culturally speaking, and it was going in that direction. And I'll talk a little more about why I think that's important at the end here. We're getting towards the end. Resentment against abolitionists. So Robert Louis Dabney talks about this, but so many did. I already read another, in that address of Christians throughout the world. He says that everything the abolitionists say about us basically isn't true, that what they're critiquing, if it ever existed, is not domestic slavery, but the abuse of it. Robert E. Lee, I won't read this whole letter to you, from 1856, but he talks about the influence of Christianity being the thing that will, in time, lead to the ending of that particular practice. And the abolitionists are trying to rush this, and they're doing more damage than they realize. So here are the reasons the American slavery system was wrong as a labor system. Anti-literacy laws, partially justified based on race. You did see these arguments happening. Now, it's no different than the arguments you saw in the North to justify their slave codes, which started in the North. But, this isn't a question about North versus South. This is just, the fact is this was partially justified based on they're another people group. And then it incentivized man capture, which means the slave trade officially ended in 1808 and was outlawed by the Confederate Constitution. But, before these times, it was Africans who were going to war or capturing other slaves from other tribes. They were, it was incentivizing. There was a price that they would be paid for that. And then I put an asterisk by it, enabled abuse. And I'm just saying that because out there on the plantation, out in the country, very hard to monitor what's going on sometimes. And so, yes, there was abuse that did take place. And so that's wrong. So these are all things that make it distasteful to Christians. And in some ways, there were some evil elements involved. I'd say especially the anti-literacy laws. How do you read the Bible? But, thankfully, they were ignored in many circumstances. Now, having said all this, and I should probably add one thing to that, partially justified based on race, because I know I might get some questions about this. Why is that? How do you say that's unbiblical, so forth and so on? Because even the ancient Hebrews had pagan slaves that they had different rules that applied to and that kind of thing. I would say this about it, and I know that this is very general, and I need to be careful because I don't want to slide into what some of those apologists at the beginning were saying, just because I have such a aversion to this as a 21st century American Christian. I don't want to impose that on the past. So I'm very careful about that. But I would say this about it. This is not just a critique of the slave labor system. This is a critique overall of the social conditions that existed in America, North, South, and everywhere. The people who came here were integrated into a labor system. Some of them, transcended that. Some of them gained their freedom. Some of them actually had slaves of their own, but they're integrated into a labor system. I think what that does is it puts barriers in the way of husbands who want to follow God's law in providing for their wives and their families. How do you leave an inheritance to your children's children? How do you fulfill the responsibility to protect your wife? This is why Christians value and produce some of the freest places in the world for people to operate with the most limited governments, partially because they want people to be able to be self-governed. And when you're in a system that makes that very hard, which we actually live in a system that makes that hard today, then it encourages the kind of character that is not responsible and does not take God's word seriously. It's also very oppressive to the human spirit if you don't have that ownership. Now, every arrangement was different. And there were people in slavery who were able to function in these ways and exert some kind of influence over their own lives. But slave masters were not required to allow them to do those things. It puts barriers in the way because the slave master becomes the one who is now responsible. Or in the case of the North, where slavery, some places had been ended, it makes it harder to employ slave with the black codes that existed, employ black people, I should say. And it does not encourage the kind of responsible freedom that I think is assumed if we are to obey God's law. So that's my argument on that. And that I'm going to kind of bring that argument to bear at the end when we talk about what I think would be my main problem with this whole state of affairs and what I think would have been a better solution to the whole thing, other than ending the institution with a war that wrecked the economy and made it so 1 million slaves, according to some estimates, starved, got sick, and died after the war. There would have been a much better way to, I think, handle this. But that is the main concern, I think, is that God's law has rules for how husbands are to treat wives, how parents are to treat children. And it's hard to accomplish those things when you don't have the freedom to move about, to work with your own two hands, to do what's best for your children, to love your wives, especially if you can't because your wife is at that plantation and you're at this plantation. To read God's word, which is, that should go without saying that that's something God wants us to do. So these are the kinds of things that I'm saying it prevented them from exercising in many scenarios, I think, responsibilities God had given them. Now, with that said, there are conditions where, especially in high crime areas and so forth, I'm talking about even today, where you have to come in and limit people's choices and try to get them to a point where they can make better choices again, or maybe their children can, because the survival of the civilization depends on it. There are situations like that. But here's some books that I would recommend reading if you want to read more about 19th century slavery: The Slave Community by John Blassingame, Time on the Cross, Fogel and Engerman, Roll Jordan World by Eugene Genovese, Southern Evangelicals and the Coming of the Civil War by Edward Crowther, and A Consuming Fire by Eugene Genovese. Now, real quick, were the radical abolitionist heroes. As a group, they were known to reject Orthodox Christianity. Most held views on racial hierarchy incompatible with today's egalitarian assumptions. In other words, most of them also thought that black people were inferior. So they just thought slavery was bad because of the conditions, but they would have, they weren't in keeping with today's thoughts on that. They're heroes hailed today, but many of them would have also seen them as not in the same category as white people. We'll put it that way. Their moral calculations did not properly account for the death and subsequent destruction connected with total war. So, in other words, let's get freedom, and they're not thinking through sometimes the cures are worse than the disease. What you've done is you've wrecked this whole economy. You've created permanent resentment towards two groups of people. You're now using one as a political pawn against the other, and that's continued to today. And the Democratic Party banks on this. It was horrible. People died, starved. There was sharecropping for years and poverty. That's a great cure for, and of course, the Civil War wasn't all about that at all. But the abolitionists were hoping that would be the effect of the conflict, and they were willing to sacrifice over 600,000 soldiers for it, and this is what happened. Their vilification of white Southerners accomplished lasting damage for race relations. They poisoned it. Now, why would I have been a progressive emancipationist? This is why wouldn't have been an abolitionist, I don't think, knowing what I know. This is why I think that modern Christian apologetics people are wrong to try to lionize the abolitionists, because there was no good immediate solution to this problem. Jefferson talked about it, Thomas Jefferson. We have the wolf by the ears. We can't safely let him go. Colonization movement was Abraham Lincoln supported that. Let's send them back to Africa. But now they've been here for generations. Africa's not their home. They had nowhere to go. There was no party proposed. They planned to emancipate and compensate and integrate. Each situation, of course, was different. Each state, each region, each plantation. The Western territories were the logical place for gaining self-sufficiency, but that was closed to them. Economically, slavery was already going to phase out. The United States was the only place it was forced in the context of a war. And self-government is a superior arrangement if personal responsibility is cultivated over time. And that's what I want to camp on. Personal responsibility being cultivated over time should be what we shoot for, whether it's today or back then. That is the best way that man is to live. That is the way all the laws that God gives to human beings are best carried out in that state where man has the most freedom, but he must have responsibility with that freedom to obey God, to have dominion, to not just be under the dominion of someone else. That's the arrangement we should be looking for, we should want, but not at the cost of our civilization itself. We don't empty the prisons out, right? And that's why I think I would have been critical, as many were, of slavery, of chattel slavery in the 19th century. On that basis, that would be my main argument against it. Why I'm glad it's gone and I don't want to see it ever come back. And it won't, obviously. But this is very different than what you're hearing from Christian apologists today. And so I've done this firsthand on a college campus, I have argued this way, and one of the key things in my arsenal to argue this, the complexities of that situation, to say it was bad, but we should have figured out a way to get rid of this gradually, is to take the moral high ground back, to say, would you want a million slaves starving and dying and getting sick? Is that what you wanted? People will say, oh no. Well, that's what the effect of freeing them that way did. That's the effect it had. I think there was a way to maybe do this without causing a lot of the resentment we have now. Unfortunately, cooler heads didn't prevail, and we didn't have that. But that's where I would have been at. And then here's another way to get people to realize what they're arguing lacks a lot of self-reflection. Is slavery gone? Ask them that question. Or ask them, why is slavery wrong? Why is slavery wrong? Then they have to appeal to a standard. What moral standard? And then, is slavery gone? Sex slavery. 3.8 million adults were victims of forced sexual exploitation, and 1 million children were victims of sexual exploitation in 2016. State-imposed labor camps. 4.1 million people are in state-imposed forced labor. Private forced labor. 16 million people were in forced labor in the private economy. The prison system. The welfare system has many features that are similar to the slavery that existed. It's generational. It's hard to get out of it. It doesn't even have the dignity of work attached to it, as William Lane Craig said. I thought he was right about that. It's not, you can get out of it, but it's very difficult. It's like the coal miners in West Virginia. You're owned by the company store. So there's nothing you can do. Debt slavery. The average American has over $90,000 in debt, according to a 2021 report. That's crazy. The national debt is almost $3 trillion. We're all slaves now. Civil slavery. We're approaching at warp speed civil slavery in this country as the government takes more and more power and control over our lives. And then, of course, spiritual slavery also exists too. Maybe that's a good evangelism thing, is just turn it around on, like, are you a slave to the devil or to Christ? But if you want to talk about labor systems, ask people about these things. Hey, is this right? You go to Walmart, hey, that shirt you're wearing, that iPhone you have, is that sweatshop labor? Was that labor from Africans who are being enslaved by the Chinese? I had a cab driver or a Uber driver in Dallas a few months ago now, and he was from a country in Africa, and he told me in his country that they had slavery still today. And he was so upset about people in this country who complain about it, who never experienced it, because he said, and it's black people enslaving black people. And it's the Chinese coming in and using children to mine for their cobalt and that kind of thing. This is really happening right now around the world. And so the rage that is given to Christians is so out of place. So, the question is slavery gone? And are you a participant in it somehow? So is it possible to live within a system with evil attached to it? This becomes the Christian question. And this is what I like to explain to people, even on college campuses who bring this up. You ask them about certain conditions that exist today, and they admit, yeah, we have some bad, messed up things happening in the United States in 2024. And then you say, okay, whatever one you pick. You could pick the prison system. You could pick shopping at Target, paying taxes that go to bad things, or Christian social workers. Pick any of them. And then you say, is it possible to live within a system that has evil attached to it? I mean, do you pay your taxes? Can you shop at Target or Walmart or wherever? Can you live in a country that, some of your taxes go to prisons? And, what do you think about the prison system? What about the welfare system? I mean, can you be a Christian and work within the welfare system to be salt and light without endorsing the whole thing and wanting it to end because it's against God's law, because God said if you don't work, you shouldn't eat? I mean, what's the limitation here? And that's similar to the conditions that existed in the New Testament. That's similar to, in some ways, the conditions that existed in the 19th century for strong Christians. They are living in a era where things aren't perfect, where you have a system, especially in the Roman world, that was horrible. But many things in the 19th century were also horrible. How are you a Christian in that? Can you be a Christian without being a hypocrite? And the answer is yes. And Paul gives us instructions on how to do that. That's the answer. And on the things in the Old Testament that just don't conform to modern egalitarian standards, tough luck. There's always going to be hierarchy. It's inescapable. And God had a way of trying to regulate it according to his law. That's the answer. And we have hierarchies, some of them not just in our society today. And wouldn't it be good if we regulated them according to God's law? That's the answer. If you don't like the answer, sorry. But here's the syllogism. I told you we get there. The Bible teaches some forms of slavery are morally acceptable under certain conditions that exist within a fallen world if regulated by God's law, resulting in better conditions. The Bible teaches some forms of slavery are morally acceptable under certain conditions that exist within a fallen world if regulated by God's law, resulting in better conditions. Number 2, social justice advocates promote unbiblical forms of slavery incompatible with human nature, resulting in worse conditions. Get them to realize what they're promoting is a type of civil slavery. They want Marxism. They want totalitarian government forcing everything. How is that not slavery? Even you want to go back to the 19th century, a whole region of the country is forced to live in a government not of their choosing. Is that violating their choice? Is that slavery? Is that civil slavery? Right? Take the moral high ground a little bit on this stuff. And then number 3, the conclusion, the biblical positions on familial slavery and reformation are superior to the egalitarian positions on civil slavery and immediacy. So what Robert E. Lee called the gradual influence of Christianity, that familial slavery offers protections, reformation to the system that comes from the Bible. These would have been preferable to just let's end it immediately and let slaves starve in the 19th century. And this, I think, also indicates God is not the moral monster they want to make him out to be. He's simply not. It's a lie on their part. And we need to be, I think, willing to say this and stand on our own 2 feet about it. All right. Well, God bless. This is part 1. And, we'll see about doing more parts if people have questions and want to go further. But this is almost 2 hours long. And I hope it helps you. And, let me know. Give me feedback, positive and negative. The slideshow is also available to you as a patron. Link is in the description. God bless.